Hi everyone, welcome to part 2 of today's lecture, and this is going to focus on invasive species and food webs in the Great Lakes. We're going to start off with a quote about changes in the Great Lakes ecosystem over the last 25 years, and where a bird, the double-crested cormorant, has been blamed for the loss of yellow perch in the ecosystem. So this person says, the reason for the lack of fish is definitely the cormorant. When I was in the Upper Peninsula, there were thousands of those birds. There were tons of them, but there were no perch. You could see clear to the bottom and there were no fish. So this person is implicating the double-crested cormorant in the decline of yellow perch in the Great Lakes. Now, as we look at this, what we're talking about there is a relationship between two species. Double-crested cormorants eat yellow perch. So to understand this, we want to start to think about an ecosystem and its trophic structure. And a trophic structure is the layers of organisms and looking at who feeds on what in an ecosystem. It typically starts with something that gathers sunlight or energy from sunlight, and that energy then goes into the food web. And this is an example here of a food chain. So it's a linear arrangement where energy flows from the sun to the plant to the herbivore to this carnivore, from that carnivore to that carnivore, and from that carnivore to the top carnivore. And this will be important in understanding community dynamics as we go forward and we start to think about ecosystems. So here's an example of these trophic levels and what their trophic levels are called. So at the lowest level, we have primary producers, then primary consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary consumers, and quaternary consumers. And the primary producers are typically a plant or alga species. So in marine systems, you have phytoplankton, which are algae. Then those are fed on by zooplankton, which are small microscopic organisms. Those then get fed on by a carnivore, a larger carnivore, and then a very large carnivore. You can build this all together and create a food web where you have organisms and the trophic levels that they occupy. And food webs get a little bit messy because if we look at some of these species, we start with phytoplankton, primary producer. We go to our primary consumer, our secondary consumer, our tertiary consumer. So if we go that way, birds are a tertiary consumer. If we go this way, phytoplankton to krill, our primary consumer, to birds, our secondary consumer, then birds are considered a secondary consumer. So it gets a little bit messy, but generally, as you move farther up, you get higher levels of consumers. And what you also find is that you have fewer individuals as you move farther up the food web. So we're going to look at the Great Lakes ecosystem. And the Great Lakes watershed is indicated here. And the green represents areas where rainfall would flow into the Great Lakes. So that rainfall flows into the Great Lakes. Let's say it flows into Lake Superior. It then flows through the St. Mary's River into Lake Huron. It then flows through the St. Clair River into Lake St. Clair, the Detroit River, then into Lake Erie, over Niagara Falls, into Lake Ontario, and then out the St. Lawrence River to the St. Lawrence Seaway. So you can track the movement of water. Lake Michigan, the same thing. It flows through the chain of lakes, over Niagara Falls, out Lake Ontario, and out into the St. Lawrence Seaway. Here you can see the elevation of those lakes, and you see that Lake Superior is the highest. It's also the deepest. Then that flows into Lake Huron. Then Lake Erie is lower. And then you have Niagara Falls, a big drop, and therefore a big barrier to upstream migration. And Lake Ontario, and then the St. Lawrence River and the St. Lawrence Seaway. So historically, organisms that lived in the Gulf of St. Lawrence or in the St. Lawrence River could get to Lake Ontario before these dams were built, but they could not get past Niagara Falls. It was impossible for an aquatic organism to migrate past Niagara Falls. Well, this all changed as we started to develop shipping routes through the Great Lakes. So you can see Niagara Falls here. It's quite a barrier. You can imagine a fish not being able to jump up Niagara Falls. When they wanted to have shipping from Lake Ontario to Lake Erie, though, they developed the Welland Canal. And the Welland Canal cuts through Ontario and connects Lake Ontario to Lake Erie by cutting through, and it has several locks because of that height difference of Niagara Falls. They have to raise ships up that height. Well, this created essentially a continuous water system between Lake Ontario and Lake Erie, and it allowed for the invasion of many non-native species. So what we're going to work on today is looking at the Great Lakes food web. We're going to look first at the native species in the Great Lakes food web, and then you're going to actually build two food webs in class. You're going to build the native species food web, and then you're going to expand that, and you're going to have a larger food web that includes both native and non-native species. So as you watch this lecture, you need to pay attention to what the species are, what they eat, because you'll use them as you build your food web. So let's start off with one of the species, yellow perch. The yellow perch is a popular fish because people like to eat them, and as young fish, they feed on zooplankton, and so zooplankton are the key thing in determining their numbers. The larger ones will feed on minnows and aquatic insects, but that linkage between yellow perch and zooplankton is going to be a key one as you go forward. Zooplankton are the small aquatic invertebrates, often microscopic, but they play a very important role in the food web. We have the double-crested cormorant. And double-crested cormorant is a large duck-like bird that dives underwater to eat fish. At one point in time, it was very rare in the Great Lakes, only seen occasionally. The first recorded breeding was in 1936, and their population is increasing. They eat things like alewives, which we'll learn about later, and they eat yellow perch. We have the lake trout. And the lake trout was kind of our large native predator in the Great Lakes that occupied the open Great Lakes. Its population experienced a lot of declines actually due to an invasive species and was almost wiped out, and now there are actually some protected areas to help lake trout reestablish in the Great Lakes. It mostly eats smaller fish, and we'll just call those minnows for the purpose of this assignment as you build your food web. We have green algae, okay, and green algae are the base of the food web. So you're going to start with them at the base of your food web, and when we talk about green algae, these are eukaryotic organisms, meaning they have a nucleus. And they are the key primary producers. So they are gathering energy from sunlight, and then all of a sudden there's energy available in the ecosystem. You have another type of so-called alga, but it's actually not an alga. It's a Cyanobacteria, more closely related to bacteria. It's a prokaryote. So people will call them blue-green algae. And it has this miraculous ability to take nitrogen out of the air. Remember, there's a lot of N2 gas in the air, and there's a lot of N2 gas dissolved in the water. So it takes the N2 gas that's dissolved in the water and turns it into a usable nitrogen that it can use to build proteins inside of the organism. And these are toxic to consumers. Most consumers will not eat cyanobacteria. And then you get these massive blooms of cyanobacteria if the ecosystem is out of balance. And again, they're at the bottom of the food web, but they essentially are a dead end in the food web. Then you have a couple different species of zooplankton we're going to talk about. The first of those is one called Diparia, and it's a small species of zooplankton, about the width of a pencil in length, so 7.8 millimeters is this one. And they are incredibly important to small fish. They are they're feeding on algae, so they're one of the two zooplankton species. And then the Daphnia water flea is the second one, and this one is really important. It's eaten a lot by yellow perch. It eats algae and plays a key role in the food web. Now, if we look at the bottom of our food web or food chain, you can see here that we have energy from green algae flowing into the Diparia and the Daphnia, and you have Cyanobacteria over here and essentially nothing feeding on them. Now, we have some interesting information that you'll want to use later in class, in the in-class assignment, and this will be included when you look at the in-class assignment. But what this shows is the Diparia populations over time. So let's look at the first time, 1994 to 1995, then 2000, then 2005. And the darker it is, the more Diparia they found in those areas. And what you can see is there were very high concentrations of Diparia at a lot of locations in the Great Lakes. By 2000, it had become much less, and by 2005, Diparia was almost absent from a lot of areas of the Great Lakes. So that gives us our zooplankton and our phytoplankton, which were the algae. Now we're going to add in some other species. Shiner minnows, they feed on those zooplankton, and things like perch and lake trout will feed on them. We have bald eagles, and bald eagles are mainly a scavenger, and they eat fish, but they're largely a scavenging species. Sometimes they will catch live fish as well. And now we're going to start to think about the introduced species or the invasive species in the Great Lakes. So these are ones that were not present before human influence, and some were actually intentionally introduced, some accidentally. So what are some of the major invasive species in the Great Lakes? If you take a minute to think about it, or you do a quick Google search, you'll find several. And probably the one that comes to most people's mind initially is the zebra mussel, but we'll get to that one a little bit later, because in terms of the invasive species in the Great Lakes, it's a relatively recent arrival. Now, the construction of the Welland Canal in the early 1900s led to a pathway for invasive species to get from Lake Ontario into Lake Erie and into the upper Great Lakes. So this is an important time, early 1900s, and what we find is that in 1919, the sea lamprey is first detected in the upper Great Lakes, having gone from Lake Ontario into Lake Erie. It's an ectoparasite, kind of like a bloodsucker or leech. It attaches to the organism, and with these raspy teeth, it will bore a hole and start to suck blood out of the organism. It's actually a vertebrate animal with a cartilaginous skeleton and a very simple nervous system. So remember, sharks have cartilaginous skeletons, and so do lampreys. And lampreys are actually more primitive, evolved earlier in terms of species in the evolution of vertebrates. And here you can see some of the damage caused. And in the 1950s and 1960s, most lake trout caught had damage like this from lampreys. It was devastating the lake trout population. Following that, in 1931, we see that the alewife, a small fish, kind of like a herring, entered the Great Lakes, and its population boomed. And its population was so extreme that there would be large die-offs on the coastlines of the Great Lakes. Well, the winds, for example, if you think about Lake Michigan, the wind usually blows from Wisconsin toward Michigan. And so all those alewives that died in Lake Michigan blew across the lake and ended up dead on the shores along Saugatuck, Grand Haven, Ludington, Manistee, all up and down the west coast of Michigan, the Lake Michigan shoreline. And these became so bad that we had to figure out something to do about them. They were destroying that coastline. The smell of them was horrendous. I remember as a young child going to the Great Lakes and seeing these piles of fish, and they just smelled horrendous. And so Lake Michigan, the beaches that now we think are amazing beaches, were not very popular in the 1950s and 1960s. Now they eat zooplankton, so we've got another species here that's going to eat the zooplankton along with minnows and yellow perch. So what do we do? What did scientists decide to do to deal with the alewives? Well, the alewife is from the Atlantic Ocean, so kind of surprisingly, they decided to bring in a species from the Pacific Ocean to eat them. And they brought in king salmon and coho salmon, two species of salmon. This is my former brother-in-law with a Chinook salmon or king salmon that he caught out in Lake Michigan. And they brought these in to control the alewives. And so this is an intentional introduction. And shockingly, it worked. So in that first lecture, I showed you a picture of Dr. Roth holding a large Chinook salmon or king salmon. And that species today still kind of controls the alewife population and basically keeps our Lake Michigan beaches clean. Okay, so we move forward to 1984, and in 1984, the spiny water flea was introduced. It probably arrived from ballast water in ships. So ships take on ballast water when they're empty to kind of keep themselves floating at a certain level, and when they get to the location where they're going to add cargo, they release that ballast water. And this has happened with several species. Spiny water flea, probably one that you haven't heard of, but the next one that came in 1988 is one that you've probably all heard of, the zebra mussel. So zebra mussels came into the Great Lakes starting in 1988, and they feed on algae that they filter out of the water. So here now we've got something that's going to feed on the algae at the bottom of our food web. They probably arrived in ship water ballast because before they develop their shell, they're a mobile kind of zooplankton, and they can float around in the water, and then eventually will they'll settle down onto a substrate and develop their shells. There's a sister species called the Quagga mussel, very closely related. You can see it's the same genus, Dreissena polymorpha and Dreissena brugensis. And the quagga mussel is larger, and in a lot of places, especially in deeper water, it has replaced the zebra mussels, but both are still major invaders in the Great Lakes. So you have all these invasive species now in the Great Lakes, and what you're going to do in class in your teams is you're going to create some food webs based on the Great Lakes ecosystem, and you're going to take those and initially, you'll create one that's just the native species. Then you'll create one that's the native and invasive species. And then you'll look at some relationships to see if you can find things like a trophic cascade or competition or other impacts that are happening through the Great Lakes food web.